I'm the Ninja Fat Man from the Doom Ninja Podcast, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual host. Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to episode 79 of Better Podcasting. In this week's episode, we're continuing our chat on the real deal of hobby podcasting. This time, it's all about the money.
Yar! In this week's Better Podcasting download, we're going to talk about how the podcast industry might not be ready for pirates.
Finally, in our Better Podback, we'll tackle a couple of questions that you answered about your mentors and the speed you listen to podcasts.
Let's start the episode now.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Better Podcasting. I'm Stephen John Drew, and I have with me Stargate Pioneer.
What's up? It's another great week. It's another great time to be podcasting, and we are excited to be talking about podcasting on a podcast called Better Podcasting. And I'm just really psyched for this episode. We got a lot of great things to talk about. But Steven, how's your week? How you been? Are you okay?
No, I'm never okay. You've known me for many years. You should know that I am never, ever okay.
You look like you need a haircut.
What? Why do I look like it? Do I need a shave and a haircut?
A shave and a haircut? You know? For what? 2 bits, right?
Exactly. I do feel like I since you went, and for the audio viewer, since SP has shaven off his beard, I have a beard if you've never seen me before, and I feel like I don't really match, and I feel like I'll be honest, the beard I feel took many years off of you getting rid of it, so I feel like I should de-age myself a little bit.
It's because my beard is about, say, 87% gray does not necessarily mean that I'm that much older than you.
Oh, man, it has been a heck of a week and lots of podcast stuff happening. And we are so excited to continue on our arc today about the raw deal of podcasting. So if you missed last week's episode, if you're thinking of starting a podcast, we'd encourage you to go back and check that out because we laid it all on the table. Like, we're not trying to discourage you, but we laid some cold, hard facts out there that you probably want to consider so that you don't set your expectations, set the bar too high. So we did that last week. So we encourage you to check that out. The other thing that I think we should take a moment here just right now, I know we talked about it last time, but you made a couple appearances last week on a couple different shows. And I think you should take another moment here to quickly talk about that because I thought you did a great job.
Yeah, over on 3 Angry Nerds on the podcast dropped on the 2nd of May. I was allowed to join their wonderful podcast, and we had a lot of great talks about general geekdom. And then as a special bonus, they have a separate podcast that they record at the same time called Nerds in Love. So if you ever want to hear SP's dating advice, you can go there. It is also an episode that dropped on the 2nd of May. I don't think they actually labeled the numbers on them, but they're the 2nd of May episodes, and I was on the 2 episodes. They were a couple of great guys, and I cannot wait to do it again with them if they call.
You mentioned the numbering, and I think this is a good opportunity for us to solicit the listeners. We usually ask you to tell us how you saved your podcast. We also encourage you to tell us what a hobby podcast means to you. But what is your take on numbering episodes? Because there's a lot of people who are very much adamant that you should not number episodes. For me personally, especially when it's timely content, like content that is about current events and things like that, I really like the numbering because if all of a sudden I come across an episode, I don't need to go fishing for a date. If I know their latest episode is episode 100 and I'm looking at 25, I kind of know what to expect. I also think numbering is nice because you can then refer back to it on your show. So it's like, okay, you know what? We did a hosting or an episode on self-hosting. If you go back to April and you search our website, you can find self-hosting. Instead, when you got numbering, you go check out episode 65 of Better Podcasting. So I am a big fan of the numbering, but I know it's a big movement. So please tell us, what do you think of numbering? Do you think that it's a thing of the past? Do you think that it's important? Get in touch with us through a variety of different ways. You can tweet us at Better Podcasting. You can write us at facebook.com/betterpodcasting or send us an email to podcast@betterpodcasting.com. Bonus tips for you, bonus points for you if you send us a video or audio clip for us to play.
We like the video. We like the audio. It's all good, though, here on Better Podcasting. And when you send in the feedback, please give your thoughts to what exactly is Steven fishing for with dates. Is it going for salmon? Is he going a little lowbrow or with like tilapia? Or is he really searching for the real deal of mermaids? And is it legal to go fishing for mermaids? You got to ask yourself that.
Why do you always got to take us to the gutter, SP? Always.
The gutter? I'm taking you to the ocean.
All right, let's go ahead and move into our topic. Here we go. Go ahead. You've been waiting. You've been waiting 79 episodes to say it. Just lay it out right now. What is the title of this topic today?
You don't have to make money podcasting. You don't have to do it. You can do it for fun. You can do it for free. You don't have to make money. It's just not something that you have to do, especially with a hobby podcast, especially with an audience that might not be as big as you might need for monetizing, but especially if you're just doing it for fun. But we're going to get into all that in a little second. Obviously, we are hobby podcasters. You know, since it's like the whole nature of the podcast, right? Better Podcasting is for the hobby podcasters. We mentioned it before. We don't talk monetization on this show. We know there's a lot of podcasts out there that do, that we know there's a lot of information out there that do. But what we want is to get information to you to improve your show if you want to get to monetization. But if you don't want to get to monetization, just so you can improve your community or have fun podcasting. So often you find people posting about money, right, Steven?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's almost like there's this expectation or even entitlement that podcasters should make money. It's really bizarre that this hobby or this platform, it's just people are like, how do I make money? It's one of the first things that often comes up, or everything comes with that slant. But yeah, we want to dive right into it today. You do not have to make money. And again, we want to really drive this home today because we have often on this show related podcasting to other hobbies. And we've done it when we've talked about buying gear or about other elements of podcasting. And today, we want to go ahead and just lay it all out there again. The reality, if you are a hobby podcaster, these are some things that you want to consider while you're setting those expectations for yourself as you enter. Now, how many other hobbies do you know of where you go out and you just walk into the hobby and you're like, I want to make money. I want to go play in my beer league and make money on playing hockey, or I want to go spend money sailboating and then go make money, or I want to go and take up stamp collecting and make money. Now, maybe
for the record, I just want to bring up that it was the Canadian that brought up the fact that beer league was hockey and not the Minnesotan. I just want to say that it was the Canadian, because down here in the United States, beer league can mean a lot of different things. You're talking baseball, you're talking other forms of exercise, indoor soccer, but no, Steven has to go beer league hockey.
That's true. That's fair. I could have gone with beer league moose riding, but I left that one alone. But no, absolutely. I think that this is something that a lot of times people who are doing this as a hobby, and let's be real here. You've probably been on some podcasting forums before or some podcasting communities, and you've seen people coming in and, you know, there's some friends who are wanting to get things going. And as soon as they start talking about money, it's really kind of odd because they are doing it as a hobby, as opposed to, could you imagine though, if you showed up to that just for fun football team that you did, or the just for fun baseball team that you were participating in, and you're like, so guys, when are we going to go make money off of this? Like, it would be a laughing stock. So we wanted to just, dive into that today. The other things that okay, on the flip side of things, let's be honest, there are some that you can make money on as a hobby. For example, running, you might get prizes, fishing tournament prizes. I did mention briefly there, stamp collecting. If you went and you sold them later, yeah, you could. But a lot of hobbies, you don't. And a lot of these hobbies here, like even the ones we just mentioned, the running and the fishing tournaments, you're not going into them saying, I am going to make money. You're kind of going, I might make money. I might eventually. If I get really good at it, I might win that race. But you're not going into it as a first-time runner being like, I will win that race.
I've got neighbors that literally race. They're literally my neighbors, and they literally race monster trucks. I can guarantee you they haven't made a dang cent because they put all their money into their trucks and to their engines. So yeah, you don't have to make money doing your hobby. You can just do it for the fun of it. And I'll tell you, a lot of places in podcasting lead you to believe the opposite. For example, so many podcasts about podcasting, believe it or not, we're not the only ones out there. There are others, but a lot of them focus on making money. It might not be their only focus, but it is a main focus because a lot of people that want to make money podcasting are going to these paid consultants asking, how do I make money? So they give that content out. We don't get that sort of content because we deliberately say we are for the hobby podcast and we don't talk about monetization. We just want to make your show and your content better. But for those hobby podcast, or for those podcasts about podcasting, they cover ways to get sponsorships, to talk about the business behind podcasting. They'll talk about every podcast related topic with a take on business. For example, a lot of network podcast talk immediately goes to money discussions.
No, I have heard so many of those. It's never about the network, and it's all about this is how you deal with the money aspect of the network. It's never about actually building the infrastructure. There's so many of them. Now, not ever. I said that term loosely, but there are some on infrastructure. But again, a lot of times they just go right for the money.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, we said it last week, and I'm going to say it again. A lot of those places offer great advice. So you just have to take it with a grain of salt and know that they're biased. But when you're a hobby podcaster, it's important to look through the glasses of a hobby podcaster. And the first step is to come to grips that you're doing this as a hobby. Stephen, we've both done this, and we found, honestly, that it was very, very liberating, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now, first thing, before I talk about the liberation, is there an Amazon affiliate link for the hobby podcaster glasses that you just spoke about?
Yes, and you can get them to go to betterpodcastinggear.com.
Yeah. No, honestly, SP and I early on in our relationship together, we talked about how we were both hobby podcasters, and it was just like we both spoke about how this was a hobby for each of us independently, not as a team, just independently. And since then, it's very much tailored our conversations in the right place. We fire so many links back and forth between each other, as well as other people of the network. And what is fantastic about just having this like absolute real world sense, we are doing this as a hobby, is we can start to filter through the crap, so to speak, when we see these links. It can be like, okay, here's this great article. A, B, C, and D talk all about money and how this is going to affect you from a monetary perspective. Let's just skip that off and let's filter it down to the core information, the stuff that matters to us. And it is very liberating to just us recognize that we don't make money on the hobby podcast and we do this for ourselves. So again, you want to ask yourself here, what are you doing this for? Are you doing this as a business or as a hobby? Because you want to be realistic. It's okay if you want to do this as a business. Absolutely. It's okay. But if you are doing it as a hobby, make sure you really recognize that you're doing it as a hobby. And on the flip side, if it is a business, There's a whole bunch of other factors that we've talked about before that you're going to want to consider. Now, if you are doing this for business purposes, we would recommend you maybe consult a business coach, or you consult some podcasts that do take that business slant, because there's a lot of really important information and sort of the nitty gritty there that they know about. They know about these things because, if they're a podcast coach, tell you what, they're not doing that for free. It is a money, or it is making them money. And so they've actually been on both sides of the coin there. So you can absolutely reach out to them. There's a lot of great ones out there, and we've talked briefly about them before, and we won't drop names just because, we don't like to be impartial, but there's a lot of really great ones. And if you want to reach out to us, we have some suggestions for you.
Yeah, and once you've come to grips with this, once you understand, once you internalize the fact that you are a hobby podcaster, that is your goal, it becomes easier, as Stephen mentioned before, to filter out the money talk. And if you've made the decision to make money, then you want to focus on that stuff. And I can recommend a couple of great places for you to go get that information. So here are some of the grounding facts that might help you remind yourself of the fact that you're a hobby podcaster. Number one, your podcast might not get enough traffic to substantially monetize or really monetize at all. I mean, it's all about the traffic to the website. It's all about the hits to your website. It's all about the downloads, and it's all about the streams. So if you want to make money, that's really where it is. I will say it's not just that. If you only have 100 listeners and 100 of those listeners are going to buy whatever you say, then you have a high conversion rate. You've found the gold, and you can leverage that. But most of the time, you're talking somewhere between 1% and 5% of people, of your listeners, will actually click on a link to buy something that you've recommended, at an affiliate link to go to your store, that sort of thing. So let's just give you some examples of that. But if you've made the decision to do hobby podcasting, it could be because you're not getting enough traffic. And number two, you may not be prepared to get involved with money. Look, guys, there's taxes involved with that. And if you start making a lot of money and you don't report it by the end of the year, you could end up owing more than you've actually made, depending on if you have any penalties or whatever. I am not an accountant. I'm not a tax advisor. If you want that information, we can direct you a couple of places. But once you get started into a business, really, there's a whole bunch of other things, a whole bunch of other headaches that you have to look into. I've actually considered that. I've actually considered making Stargate Pioneer Productions into an LLC for a lot of different reasons. And I might still do that, but it's not going to be as a business entity. Is basically going to be, for tax purposes anyway, as a hobby. We won't get into that now, but I might if I go further in that. Here's another thing, Stephen. You might not have time to monetize. I mean, if you start making money, do you have the time to go through all that accountability?
Yeah, because there's a whole bunch of things involved with that, not just the tax perspective, but all of the back end relationships, the things that you're doing with that income. There's a whole bunch of other headaches that you might just not have the time, and you might not just be prepared to deal with that level of accountability, because it is. Again, once you start a business, it is a whole other can of worms. You can ask, don't even think about podcasting. Don't even think about podcasting. Go to somebody else, someone outside of podcasting who has taken what was a passion and turned it into a business, and ask them about the headaches that came with that. I have personally known many different people who have been like, you know what? I'm really good at working on cars. I think I'm going to make some side income. Oh, crap. Look at the problems that I've had, right? The other thing as well is people who maybe, do a little bit of restoration or painting or stuff like that. Same idea. Lots and lots of headaches come with that. So you might not be prepared for that. Another thing that's kind of hard to accept sometimes is that there just may not be interest in your genre as far as selling advertisements or trying to make money off of it. You might just be podcasting on something that's overly saturated already. Maybe your take on something is not something that people want to pay for. You don't know, but there is a chance that what you do might not even be a part of a genre that is monetizable.
Yeah. So, Stephen, let me ask you a question. What are two things that you control as a podcaster, whether you're a hobby podcaster or not? Do you have any idea?
What are two things that I control? What I say?
Okay, that is true. Let me just give you what I'm looking for. You control your brand and you control your integrity, right? So if you go with monetization, maybe with an advertiser, all of a sudden you're linked to them. So whatever they do or whatever they support as a company, you're linked to, and it might not be in line with what you're trying to do as a podcast. So your brand is damaged and your integrity is damaged.
Yeah, that's a great point, because once you start to build these relationships, if one of you do one thing, it essentially affects the other. How many times have we seen on big, massive levels, big celebrity says something that offends everybody, and then a bunch of sponsorship pulls back, right? Because, they've got that relationship. You can look at it, and this happens all the time. Or flip side, all of a sudden an employee of a company says something, it's connected that they're an employee of a certain company has to come out and say, this employee no longer works for us, because they've got that relationship, right? And that's what happens. Once you start to connect money, you are in a relationship of some form.
Yeah, and Steven, if you like it that much, why don't you put a ring on it? That's what I'm saying. Man. That's what I'm saying. It is okay. Let me emphasize this. It is okay not to make money podcasting. It absolutely is. As a matter of fact, Rob Walsh was at Podcast Movement in Chicago last summer. He gave a speech and he said it was okay not to make money podcasting. Apparently, I've heard this from multiple sources. The entire auditorium gave him just a rousing applause. I don't think it was a standing applause, but it was applause anyway. Let's go over some of the things you can podcast for if it's not for money. You can podcast for fun. You can podcast to build a community of like-minded people or people interested in the same things, same hobbies. You can podcast to be seen as an expert to drive people to other ways that you're going to make money, right? And you can podcast to learn about a subject. I'll give you a little hint. I actually started podcasting to learn how to podcast because I just wanted to learn. So the first show that I did, Voices of Defiance, was largely because I wanted to know how to do it. So I was able to do it, and that was great. Now, if you podcast as a hobby, here are some considerations. First of all, make sure you stay in budget and that you spend time with your friends and family. Balance your life, right, Steven?
Yeah, absolutely. The life balance is huge. It is. We've talked about it before. It is so easy to get addicted to podcasting. It's a very addictive hobby, and you want to make sure you balance your life. There is a life outside of podcasting. It kind of all ties back. One of the reasons my opinion, this is Stephen Jonder opinion here. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people get into podcasting as a hobby, and next thing you know, it's consuming their life, is because of that money aspect. What it is they're coming into this community where some of the big names are all about making money. So now they're really talking about all the time they're putting into it, and there sort of becomes a sense that I need to do the same. I need to start showing up to all of these other random live podcasts with big names, or I need to start doing my own podcasts that are in that genre. I need to respond to every darn thread on every group because I'm seeing all these other people doing it. Well, these people that are doing it, that are making money, they have a vested interest in that. That's one of the reasons they're spending so much time, because it's their sort of way to make a return on investment, right? They're investing their time so that people can find their name and then can end up coming over and seeing their product and maybe end up giving them some money. So they've got good reason to do this. As a hobby podcaster, you come in, you don't feel the obligation to that. You don't need to do that. If you got time to respond to some threads, do it. If you got time to get in to be part of a community, do it. But recognize it is just your hobby. You don't need to do what all these other money makers are doing.
No, you do not. If you're a homeowner, there's house repairs to make, like the deadbolt that I just repaired. You might have grass to mow. You might have snow to shovel. You might have an engine in your son's car that you have to pull out, and you have to break it down all the way to the small block because there's something going on with that piston pin. You might have to do that. And if you have to do that, you're not going to be able to spend a lot of time podcasting. So you have to separate that podcast life and that home life, or the other than podcast life. Look, you might have a big, huge project going on at work. I know over on the Starling Tribune, our co-host Neil has had just a rough time, actually a very successful time, but he's a rough time at work. And that's why we haven't seen him so much on the Starling Tribune lately. We really miss him. We wanted to see him back, but we understand there's a lot of stuff going on at work, and real life for a hobby podcaster always kind of trumps podcasting. Not kind of, I misspoke there. Real life does trump podcasting.
All right, before we continue on here, I feel like we need to take a moment here to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that if you want to start a podcast therapy podcast where you bring on guests to talk about problems in their lives that are interfering with their podcasting, you should let SP know, because I believe that car analogy came from the heart. So if you're going to do that therapy podcast, I encourage you to reach out to Stargate Pioneer, because I'm pretty sure he's going to guest on it.
I actually think there is a podcaster's therapy podcast, by the way, Stephen. Yeah, so there you go. And I don't necessarily need a podcast therapy podcast. I need a how to overhaul your engine podcast.
Yeah, so keep that in mind. And one of the things when you are doing this as a hobby is kind of along the same train of thought is don't burn yourself out and be prepared to take the break. We've talked about ways to manage breaks before, and really it's important as we have this discussion now. Again, don't feel you have to do what everybody else who is giving you all this advice that has a slant towards money is telling you. Make sure you treat it as a hobby. If you were in that hockey league and you ended up having something come up, would you be like, you know what? I think that I'm going to miss my son's first birthday because I have to make sure to attend that game. Probably not. You're probably going to...
I don't know, man. It's only his first birthday. He's not going to remember it anyway.
Okay. Am I going to miss my daughter's 16th birthday for that?
Oh, no, that's not going to happen. There was even a day taken off for work for that.
So, remember, again, it's your hobby. Don't burn out. Make sure if it comes too exhausting, you do take a bit of a break. And finally, before we get off of this topic and move on to our download, we have a question for you as the listener. You don't have to answer, but we would love it with your honesty. Do you podcast for money? Is that one of your goals? Is podcasting for money? And if you don't podcast for money, what do you podcast for? You can disagree with us, you can agree with us, but we absolutely want to know, do you podcast for money? And if not, what do you podcast for?
Right. We just want to know what your motivations are, and we will probably create some content in those areas. But I will guess that the most people that actually podcast or listen to Better Podcasting do not podcast for money, or if they do, it's more of a side thing, and that they actually podcast for fun. And the money that they're podcasting for is just to pay the podcasting bills, which is okay. But we just want to know, what do you podcast for? What's your motivation? Why are you podcasting? Because it's important. You go back to episode 1. That is the part of the planning your podcast that you can find in episode 1 of Better Podcasting, found at betterpodcasting.com.
Sure is a good thing that we labeled those numbers, hey? But let's go ahead and move into our download. Here we go.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
First off, I should just apologize for the opening with my terrible pirate joke. Let's be honest. It was absolutely terrible. We are not talking about the pirates with the patch and the peg leg. No, if you were looking here to hear about that sort of podcast industry, you have reached the wrong podcast. Today, we're talking about the illegal pirate, the one that's maybe from your neighbor or your home. I don't know. Maybe your neighbor has a peg leg and a pirate patch too. I don't know. I shouldn't judge here.
I watch The Martian all the time. He's a pirate.
Sure, fair enough. No, there was actually an interesting article that was recently posted. If you go to geeks.link/pirate, it will take you to an article on observer.com that relates the podcast industry to a recent event that happened with piracy. If you didn't hear about it, the popular Netflix show Orange is the New Black was indeed pirated from the production company that was working for it, and it was released. Now, interesting thing that before we actually go into more of the details on the download, what happened was these hackers actually went and they took the Orange is the New Black and they demanded money or else they were going to release it. Some time went by, Netflix didn't respond, and guess what? They released it. And here's the interesting thing about the state of piracy before we kind of get into this here is nobody cared. Netflix didn't care, nobody cared, and actually, allegedly, the numbers on the download of the Orange is the New Black season was not that great because people who are wanting to watch it, they're used to it. They're like, I'm used to this coming out in July. I pay my money for Netflix. I don't want to watch some terrible unfinished footage because part of it was unfinished. I'm just going to wait. I don't care. So it's an interesting turn in piracy.
I have another theory about that. The people that watch the Netflix might not have the technical skills in order to pirate or know how to do it in order to pirate these things. But it doesn't matter. I mean, if I'm watching a show on Netflix, I'm going to watch that show on Netflix. Why wouldn't you? I guess maybe to speed up the episode, but there are things that you can buy, programs you can buy online to actually speed up the episode. But basically, yeah, nobody cared. This happened with Netflix. I know piracy was a big deal during the Game of Thrones before they put out the app that anybody could buy in case you didn't have a cable subscription, because even HBO was like, yeah, streaming's a big deal. We gotta go with it. But that is TV. That is streaming TV, and piracy happens with broadcast TV all the time. The thing, though, that this article in The Observer titled "The Podcasting Industry Still Hasn't Dealt with Security Threats" was, of course, the podcasting industry. What is the podcasting industry doing to secure their workflows? And is there a real need for it? And to jump to the end here, Stephen, no, I don't think the podcast industry cares. And we'll get to why in a second, but what are podcasting companies doing to ensure privacy? Well, the Observer went out to ask some people that were in the production side of podcasting, and they asked Corey Coates, who's a manager at a production company called Podfly. And Corey responded, in short, file exchanges with production companies and clients are largely done via Google Drive and Dropbox. From there, many production houses use Adobe Creative Cloud for collaboration with showrunners, engineers, and producers. Now, The Observer also reached up to Brooklyn's 2Up Production co-founder Zach Akers, and he wrote back to The Observer in an email that it, meaning the company 2Up Production, had just begun thinking about more serious security protocols, perhaps as recently as when The Observer reached out to him. Quote, we have started the process of making sure all our IP is stored on a private server with two-step verification as a bare minimum going forward. But there will be more precaution taken beyond that, especially in light of recent events. So I don't think that they actually reached out to any of the podcast service companies such as Libsyn or Podbean. So take all that with a grain of salt. But they did reach out to the podcast advertising companies. And there was EW Scripps that responded with, quote, the actual economic impact of a breach is not super significant. And this comes from Eric Dine, who's the CEO of Scripps. While the industry is profitable and growing, the cost for losing any one show is not so great that his company has focused on adding steps into the production process to better secure content. And then over on Midroll, their threat model focused more on protecting its customers, particularly user data, for people using its podcasting app, Stitcher, especially, get this, the payment information for premium subscribers. So you have the production companies and the advertising companies that were surveyed for this article. I got to tell you, though, Stephen, are podcasts actually paid right now?
Some are. There are some that have the wall, but how many of them are not? A large amount of them. And that's I think one of the biggest differences here that we see is that podcasts are often free. Again, there are some ones that do have the paid wall, but overall, they're free.
They are. So let me ask you this. Do you ever see yourself paying if some content was going to be released prematurely?
I would never pay, like, if it was illegal, I would never pay. I don't support that stuff at all. If somebody had a podcast that I really liked and they were wanting to make it paid, I would consider it. I'm a big advocate for paying for content. And
I meant if pirates stole your show and was going to release it before you wanted to release it, would you pay them?
I would not. There's not a chance that I would, because here's the bottom line is that I have every podcast episode that I do, I have an hour and a half in it. I don't care. Whatever. You're going to take that and you're going to release it early. Okay, whatever. I've lost an hour and a half of my time. I don't care.
Here's the flip side. If pirates want to take my content and they want to distribute it, that means I reach more listeners. So go ahead. And be my guest.
And I think, one of my big takes that I had on this was that I don't think that the comparison of this article is fair. And I'll tell you why it's not fair. Because Orange is the New Black is a product that I pay for. That's what I pay for. I understand I get a variety of other things within my subscription, but essentially I am paying for that product. With podcasts, I am generally getting them for free. I don't think that it is a fair comparison to relate the two, because the other thing that's super important is that with stuff that you pay for, like Netflix and other streaming things like that, you are not generally getting the raw file for you to take and have on your computer for all of eternity. There's ways to do it, but for the way that they distribute, they give me access to Netflix. If I cancel my subscription to Netflix, I don't get that anymore. If I go and unsubscribe from a podcast, I have the file. And when you look at that, what is the bigger concern? What is the bigger concern? Is it that somebody's going to come in and release this content early? Or is it that they're going to take like a monetized product or something like that, where they go and they hit subscribe? Oh, look, I have an MP3. And then I'll just go and, you know what I might do? I might make a little black site that I go and I just chop out all of those ads. How many times have we heard ads? I forget what show it was, but somebody talked about how people constantly complain about 15 minutes of ads up front. If somebody really wanted to make an illegal site, that would be an angle to do. You take that podcast, you take out the 15 minutes and you release it separately. Now, I don't advocate that by any means. I think that would be very unfair. I think that would not be polite. And I think that obviously would be illegal, but it would, potentially be something that people would look into. It's completely different than me going and paying for a service and just getting it streamed to me. I think that it's an unfair comparison.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, no podcast host companies were pulled. I know Libsyn recently went to the HTTPS, so to better secure the content, to better play with distribution hubs that were secured. And as a hobby podcaster, website security. If you run a website, that is probably your biggest threat, not necessarily about your files. And as we mentioned, most podcasts are free. And if you do use a professional podcast media host, such as Libsyn, I think from my standpoint, nothing's for sure, but I think you're pretty secure, at least for now. But in the future, just look out, because they might be a target. You never know.
Well, and that's the other thing that when we have to look at it in the comparison is with something like Netflix. They go and they've made all of this content. They filmed it all in advance, and it's all being done behind the scenes. It's all being built. Podcasting generally doesn't work that way. Even if you're pre-recording content, a lot of people are not pre-recording it for a year in advance. No, what they're doing is they're pre-recording it in smaller blocks. A lot of people work week to week like us. There are people who work longer than that. So it's just not the same, because if you go and you're taking a file, you're making a file, then you go and you upload it and you hit publish almost right away. Maybe there's a day or two in there. What happens if somebody ends up getting in there? They get it a couple days early. Like I just think it's not as big of a deal as well when we look really at sort of the way that, the bigger names, that have been around in podcasting for a while, a lot of them, the sort of old school, Gen 1 podcasters have started to adopt live. And I think that that's another thing to consider. All of these people are now doing things live, which means they're putting it out there raw. They're putting it out there unedited. They're open to people criticizing that, seeing the mistakes, seeing all of these things. And they're also open to somebody opening up this live stream and hitting record. And they've accepted that. So I think that sort of speaks to maybe the future of the industry, maybe where people are caring a little bit less about the polished product compared to what it was. And I just, again, I think it's not necessarily the most fair comparison.
Yeah, and just to end on one other example, for instance, Emily Prokoff, who we've had on this podcast talking about journalism and the traits to use there. She's on maternity leave right now. She did pre-record 8 weeks, I believe, or 4 weeks worth of content, which had been streamed. If somebody wanted to, they could have gone into Libsyn, which I think she uses as a media host, and they could have found those files there and they could have, but what is that going to get you? I mean, she's got a great show, but I like when it comes out twice a week. I mean, it's fun. It's like, boom, oh, hey, another episode of The Story Behind. Yay, I get something to listen to on my way to work.
Yeah, so check this out. It's geeks.link/pirate yar. There's no yar on it. But check that out and let us know what was your thoughts on it. We absolutely want to know. Maybe you agree with the article. Maybe you think that it's not a fair comparison. In either way, I think it's worth a read and definitely worth checking out. And let's go ahead and see what you had to say about your podcast and our questions this week. Okay, should we just talk really fast so that the people who are listening on faster speeds just hear chipmunks, or should we talk really slow so that it doesn't work?
If you did catch the Easter egg at the beginning of the show, at the top of the episode, when I was alluding to the speed of podcasts, I sped up as fast as I possibly could. So if you're listening at 1.5 or 2x or 3x or whatever you listen to, I don't know if you heard what I was saying or not, but that was for you right there. So we asked a question on Twitter: what speed do you listen to your podcasts on? And Karen at MS Enthusiast got back to us and she said 1 or 1.5. 2x if it's a section I'm not interested in or need to find where I left off. So thank you very much for that, Karen. That was enlightening. Over on Forgotten TV, that is at Forgotten TV Show, tweeted us back and said, many shows it's 1.5x, but it depends on the host and format. Shows that have a lot of song or movie show clips don't lend themselves to this. Yeah, if I'm podcasting about Arrow and I'm listening to Stephen Amell, I don't want to speed him up because I don't want him to be talking like this.
We also had what was his name? Stargate Pioneer said, I listen at 1.5 times or 2.0 when I can. Unfortunately, the iPod Classic does not have an option to speed up playback. Darn SP, darn.
No, but if I'm listening on my phone or I'm listening on my iPod Nano, I'm at 1.5 or 2x. So also, Airlia, I guess at Airlia Pod said 1x, but I'm not sparse for time to listen at work. So I don't got to plow through it. And at Zachary Webb responded to us and he said 1x most of the time. I have more time than most people. Stephen, remember when you were 20 years younger and you had all the time in the world? That was good times.
I was going to make a joke, but I'll leave that alone. And finally, we had Podcast Movement. That's right, at Podcast Movement said, good question. Don't think we have ever changed it from the standard setting. So I'm assuming that this means that everybody that attends Podcast Movement is legally required to listen to all of their podcasts on the standard setting of their podcast app. It's the only way that I can interpret that tweet.
I know 2 people in specific that would actually kill if that was the case.
This is what the Podcast Movement said it to us. So that it means it's a legal requirement before entering Podcast Movement. They're going to check you at the door to make sure they're going to check you.
Show me your Overcast app settings. Come on, get that iPad out. We'll see what your settings are.
Okay, so before we move on to our next feedback there, I want to say about the speed. One of the reasons why I asked this is because I actually do have limited time to listen to podcasts, and I really struggle with this. There are some that I listen to fast where possible, but I have a problem because I feel like it's taking away from the intended pacing and essentially feel of the show that the podcaster is making, right? They've set this out assuming 1.0 times. So I have troubles because I really like, I like to savor the flavor, so to speak, of the podcast. And I feel like when I go to 1.5, I'm rushing them and I'm just, not doing them fair justice. So anyways, I have troubles with it. There are some that I listen to, but I really, really try to listen on 1.0 where I can.
Yeah, I have limited time now, so I try to speed it up as much as I can. But if I'm working, 1x is fine because I'm not really paying attention to it all that much anyway. And it's just in my ears. So moving on to another question that we asked on Twitter, @BetterPod asked, who are your podcast mentors? And I'll own up, this was a question from me. And my intent was to ask, like, who's your podcast coach? Who do you go to for mentoring? That sort of thing. And the responses I got in some cases were pretty good, but in some cases were kind of off the mark. So if you have somebody that you go to for podcast advice, a podcast running buddy, somebody that you're asking questions to, please let us know. But in the meantime, we're going to go through these responses. And I think the first one is @AirliaPod. And I really apologize because I'm probably butchering your name. So please let me know. Why don't you send in a clip and let us know how to pronounce the name of your podcast. AirliaPod said, you guys for how to be a podcast. @DNR Podcast for how to tell a story. That's interesting, Stephen. Telling a story. That is a specific skill set, which we have not delved into right now. But yes, thank you very much for your answer. And then our stalwart Australian listener @Joshua Liston said, as a listener, Dan Carlin and Bill Burr. As a podcast creator, Rob Greenlee, who's over at Spreaker, by the way, and Elsie Escobar, who's VP of podcaster. No, she is the podcaster happiness expert over at Libsyn.
Competitors. You're listening to two competitors. we also had Diami Puloki say @Wood Whisperer is very cool. And we had the Chris Farrell say my podcast inspiration, so a little bit different, was @AcidTech, @Scott Johnson, @Showwood, @Justin R. Young, @ThatKevin Smith, and @The Real Dvorak, and more I'm probably forgetting.
He didn't say @BetterPod.
You know why?
Why?
Because how can you inspire somebody that is better than you? He's better than us.
Yeah, that's right. He is the Chris Farrell, and he is the ultimate producer on Sunday mornings on GonnaGeek.com on the ATGN or All Things Good and Nerdy show.
We had the Anthony Bachman say Kevin Smith, Chris Hardwick, Joe Rogan, Julian Little, Sean Pryor, and the All-Around Comics and 11 O'Clock Comics crews. And Doom Ninja Podcast said @ThatKevin Smith was an inspiration to us both. So maybe we'll have to reword that next time we want to go down that avenue, because I think we didn't really get the answer that you wanted, to be honest. But we kind of cycled back to that whole inspiration thing we talked about a little while ago and got a few new responses. So still interesting to see how people were inspired. But yeah, I think we should retackle that in the future, actually laying out your intended question.
W. Scott Smith 19, I believe, is his Twitter name. He's in the chat right now, and he said, our mentors would be the two of you.
Aw, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there has also been another little happenstance on Twitter, and it has been #RandomMoosePictures. Yes, Stephen wanted to tag people with random moose pictures. So go ahead, tweet @StephenJohnDrew and #RandomMoosePictures and put your random moose picture on there. So there you go. We've had a couple of participants already, but we want to make sure we flood Stephen John Drew's Twitter stream with #RandomMoosePicture.
Yeah, it's probably better that way. You know, it's pretty boring otherwise. So cool. And we also had Allison say, new to podcasting, this is worth a listen, and talked about our last episode where we just laid it out raw. So thank you very much for that, Allison. And also, we had a couple of emails that we're actually not going to read the whole things out because they are quite long. But we had Diami Puloki email us with some information following up about his entire setup for On the Road. So we'll go ahead and link some of these pictures in the latest episode, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com/79. And also, we had Johnny Pennington email us about our YouTube channel. That's right. If you're not familiar with it, we do stream this show via video to youtube.com/GonnaGeek. We do that live when we record. And then when I go and I edit the whole thing, I actually edit the video product to match the audio product so that they're this one and the same. And then they go and post that up there. Well, Johnny did some analysis for us. And again, sorry, Johnny, we're not reading this whole thing out. I know you thought that we would, but it's pretty long and we're just not going to this time. But he was talking about the number split that we got, because the way that we work is with our YouTube channel. We leave the raw version out that we stream. The version that's out with all the errors, we leave on our YouTube channel. And then once our edited version goes up, the raw version goes down. And he was noticing a number split because he actually, Johnny, thank you for so much. He's told us many times that he actually really likes to see the raw version because it's another way to learn. He can see us doing things live. And I got to say, before I continue with your email, that's one of the big reasons I love live shows, because I learn from people the same way. I see how they handle mistakes. I see how they interact with people that are in the show. I see it all. And it is a fun way to learn. And he was talking about whether we should maybe release the raw version later after we post the edited version, or whether we should just leave them both up. And he had a couple of suggestions. And I got to say, anytime you release content on multiple places, it is really hard to find the right balance, especially if you're streaming live. This is something that if you go and you say, okay, I'm going to stream it live and then I'm going to pull down the content like we used to do. I'm going to pull down the content. And this could be for your audio podcast too, because you could use Mixler or Spreaker to do it. You go, I'm going to pull it down until I edit my podcast and put it up. Now, all those days that you're waiting to get that up is potential listeners that aren't getting it. So right now, the way it works is we leave that raw version up, and somebody who wants to just go and check it out, they can check it out and they can see it and they can get it in the here and now. And, they're not sitting there waiting for the few days. On the flip side, if you go and you hide that, if you go and you leave that up, you are splitting things. You are absolutely splitting things. And what ends up happening is the people who saw the original version might not come back for the edited version later. And so what ends up happening is you might be leaving a negative impression if you leave it out there. So it's kind of like there are a ton of pros and cons. It's something that we've gone back and forth on. We've actually handled this in different ways on the show. And I wanted to actually spend a bit of time here just briefly talking about Johnny's email, because I think it's something that more and more podcasters are dealing with, even just audio podcasters, because they are streaming live to services like Spreaker, where it leaves the podcast up should you want. And I kind of want to know, how do people deal with it? Because I absolutely have done the pros and the cons decision tree of this, and they both pretty much stack up evenly.
It depends on what kind of content you have, right? So a couple of my shows are TV-based shows. Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. is largely about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which just got renewed for season 5. Yay, we're so happy we get to podcast another year on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then over on the CW network, we do a podcast on Arrow called Starling Tribune. Those are two time-specific contents. Now, I do leave the raw video up. And it's actually a slightly different produced version, but it's essentially the raw video version up on YouTube for Starling Tribune. And for Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D., it's the same thing. I actually leave the raw recording up on the GonnaGeek.com YouTube channel until I can get that produced version up, which might be a few days later, because heck, this is hobby podcasting. So that raw unproduced version, which doesn't have the nice templates on it, just because the way I capture it in OBS, isn't up there for a few days. But the content is. So people that really want to know what's going on with the show, like this is the end of the season and in May of 2017, and these two shows, there's a lot going on. So people just want to know about it, and they want to talk about it, and they want to think about it for a week. Will they come back and see the live or the produced version of the video later? I don't know. Will they listen to the podcast the next week when I release it Sunday night? I don't know. I already know that I'm not hitting the mark with the audio of not getting it out that night, because I've been told by many in the industry, if you want to hit the most impact, it's going to be the next day. Sorry, I can't do that with my content. I need it edited before it goes out, because it's a better experience for the listener. I know that. So it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. I do leave the live audio up on Spreaker for those two shows, much like we do here on Better Podcasting. Now, here on Better Podcasting, we've got nothing to hide. We just prefer to release on our RSS feed and in the video a finished version, because this could be timeless content and people could come back to it years later. So we like to just polish it up a little bit on Better Podcasting. That's why we do that. But in the meantime, if you want to go to Spreaker, my Spreaker account, and get the live version of the audio, you're more than welcome to. If you want to go to our YouTube channel, you're in general more than welcome to. There's sometimes where we don't record live for various reasons, or there's sometimes we pull it down for various reasons, but it's generally available in one format or the other. And we just do that because we want to get you the content if you just really want it. And that's how we've been doing it. So, Johnny Pennington brings up a great point, and I want to say he signed off rather uniquely. He said, anyhow, maybe it will be easier read for you guys when I write you another long super email. Your 16,428th best fan, Johnny Pennington. So Johnny has positioned himself above the 16,429th best fan and below. So if you've made that cut above the 16,429, you have beat Johnny Pennington in our best fan.
In all fairness, fans 1 through 16,428 are also Johnny Pennington. But no, and the last thing that I quickly want to mention before we go off of this, because I know a lot of people are doing live, and again, this totally, in my opinion, applies to your audio shows as well, is there is a lot of notification stuff that's built in when you go live. And you go live on Mixlr, if someone subscribed to you, if you go live on Spreaker, there's even tweets, YouTube. It'll actually, if you're subscribed to the channel, it'll send you an email. So what you are giving up by pulling down that feed as well is the people who see that after you've recorded and want to go see it, because they might not come back in a few days. And that's a big consideration. If somebody goes into their inbox and they see, oh, I miss SP doing the latest episode of SP's Therapy podcast, what you might find is that they just don't want to come back in a few days when SP's polish that up. They might want to just go see it right now as it's on their mind. So if you go and you've got that pulled down now there's nothing for them to see. So absolutely big pros and cons to both. And I want to know, if you stream live, how do you handle it? What do you do if you release an edited version of your show later? Please get in touch with us through any of the ways, because this is a fantastic question / suggestion that Johnny brought up.
Yeah, and as you're replying to Steven, remember to post a random moose picture and hashtag him, #random moose picture.
Well, thank you everybody who came on by the live recording today at Geeks.live. We do usually stream this at Geeks.live. And that includes Jason Bryant, who came by and said, dropping in to say hello, heading to Spreaker to listen as we're on the way to dinner. See that? Woo-hoo! He's listening to us with other people too. He says, as we're on the way to dinner. So my apologies for us ruining your drive to a lovely dinner. And we also had Scott Smith say, in reference to the podcast therapy podcast that we discussed, he said, would that involve a podcast couch? Tell me, why do you hate your hosting?
What did your microphone ever do to you?
Exactly. How offended were you that your host tagged you in a random moose picture?
#random moose picture.
But there you go. We've reached the end of the show. If you like what we've talked about, get in touch with us. If you didn't like what we talked about, get in touch with us as well, because we're always shaping the show to the listeners. We just want to hear from you. But that is the end of episode 79 of Better Podcasting. I'm Stephen John Drew. I'm going to go lay on my podcast couch.
I'm Stargate Pioneer, and I'm looking forward to next week's episode about podcast conferences.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.